Hi, I'm Crystal Hurd, and welcome to my channel, That Lewis Lady. Today, I wanted to talk about Albert Lewis, which is C.S. Lewis's father. Sort of a controversial figure in the Lewis biography. Not just with his biographers, but Lewis himself talks about this a little bit in Surprised by Joy. They did have a pretty rough relationship, but it was common for a lot of the modern writers to have struggling relationships with their parents. So Lewis wasn't the only one. And if you're interested in this, there's a book called Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know that talks about Irish fathers and their Irish sons, modern writers like Yeats, and sort of explores the dynamic of their relationship. Really interesting read. But let's talk about Albert a little bit. Albert was actually born in Cork on August 23rd, 1863. He was the last child, the final child of Richard Lewis. Richard was a shipbuilder, and eventually the family would migrate to Belfast because there was a shipyard there and he could, get more work. And eventually he actually opened his own business called McIlwaine and Lewis, which operated for a little while. And that port, of course, very famous port. That's where the Titanic was built. And the Lewis company, actually, his company did build a ship called the Titanic, but it's not the same one. It's a different one. And that actually had a very long and successful career on its sea journeys. So it wasn't a passenger ship. But it's really interesting that Belfast is a lot of working class people. So Albert grew up in this environment around a lot of working class folks. And they did move, again, they moved to Belfast and had a pretty successful career for a little while with McIlwaine and Lewis. Eventually, that business disintegrated, and his brothers ended up moving up later. But Albert just had something different about him. So let's talk about how Albert Lewis grew up. When he was a teenager, Albert really, really loved to read. He just seemed cut from a different cloth than some of his family members. His father also loved to read. Richard, the shipbuilder, also loved to read, but there was just something different. He was very precocious, very intelligent. He was a great speaker, a great guy for argument. And so from that young age, Richard kind of understood that Albert may have a different path in life because he had these sort of special skills, and they did believe that they were God-given skills. So Albert did go to the sort of district school for a while, and then finally he got a chance for about 2 years, from 1877 to 1879. He attended Lurgan College, and the schoolmaster there was William T. Kirkpatrick, or as affectionately known as the Great Knock. And they formed a lifelong friendship there. As you know, William T. Kirkpatrick is the Great Knock, which Lewis talks about in Surprised by Joy as his tutor while he was a teenager. He also tutored Warren to prepare him for his Sandhurst exams. So, interestingly enough, he taught all three Lewis men, very interestingly. So, while Albert was there, even though his grades weren't the best, Kirkpatrick says in a letter later that there was something of the divine fire in Albert. There was just some spark, some X factor, something that Albert had that was impressive. And so he, for the rest of his life, maintained a friendship with Albert. Unfortunately, in 1879, the Lewis family ran out of money. And so there's a letter basically where Richard says, "I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to go get a job. Like, we don't have any money. It's being very difficult, especially with, everything sort of changing. So I'm going to need you to go, find a job." So basically in 1880, Albert goes to do soliciting apprenticeship with McLean, Boyle, and McLean. And he actually had to go to Dublin to do that. So he went south and did some apprenticeship and work in Dublin. So he did really well. He did come back quite often. In 1881, the very next year, he was inducted into the Belmont Literary Society, which is in Belfast. And we have some of the speeches that he made there, which give us great insight into the mind of Albert Lewis and great insight into where C.S. Lewis got a lot of his writing style and his impressions and the way he writes. Very similar. Apple doesn't fall far. So, despite not being able to stay an extended period of time at Lurgan, he does very well in the apprenticeship. And in 1885, in June, he passes with flying colors his solicitor exams. So Albert can now practice law and full time, not only as an apprentice but as an individual, and he does so pretty well. He had already been sort of turning heads in his time as a young man because he was making political speeches for the Conservative Party then. He was a proponent of home rule, and that is essentially what home rule is that the monarchy, the British monarchy, would continue to exert control and govern Northern Ireland, which, as we all know, is still happening now, because that's why you use British pounds when you go to Northern Ireland, and then euros once you go south. So what Albert was fighting for is actually still in place. So Albert was actually a very promising politician, in training. And then after a while, he just seemed like it just seemed very compromising. He wasn't a fan of a lot of the things that happened. And because he was a working class person himself, noticed that a lot of the working class clients that he had as a police court solicitor, because that was his job, he became a police court solicitor instead of becoming a politician. And why is because he was not comfortable with many of the things that were happening behind closed doors in politics. He just couldn't do it with his conscience. And so he decides instead to become a police court solicitor to serve the people of Belfast and sort of give back to his community. And while that's an absolutely wonderful thing, he had no idea how much work that would be. It's a lot of work. An extremely lot of work. And on top of that, he didn't always have his clerk, was in and out. So on top of being, one of the great things about being really good at your job is that everybody wants you to represent them. And he was very, very adamant that he protect and defend people who were poor, disenfranchised, oppressed, people that in the working class, like he grew up with. He did not grow up in privilege. So he wanted to defend and give those people a fair shot. If you're interested in a little bit more of what Albert thinks, in 2020, I published one of his short stories, The Story of the Half Sovereign, which is about, in Misjudged, which is about a poor man who gets wrongly jailed for trying to pass a counterfeit coin, which it turns out it's not counterfeit. And so this poor man ends up spending months and months in jail. And misses Christmas with his family because they are being prejudiced against him because he's poor. So these are the types of ideals, and Albert talks about that quite a bit in his diary. But he was very busy. Not only did he have the clients through the court, he also had several civic organizations. This included the Belfast Corporation, the Belfast City Council, the County Down Railroad, the Belfast Harbour Commissioners, the Post Office, the Ministry of Labor, and the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. All of those civic organizations were in addition to his regular load, which is wild. So he actually becomes very well known in Belfast, very successful. There are pictures of him drawn, caricatures of him in the newspaper. People are writing poems about him in the newspaper. I mean, it's wild. He became wildly successful and was well known as an advocate, and that is a quote, an advocate for folks who needed it, and was known as a tough person in the courtroom to beat. Sounds like somebody you probably know, C.S. Lewis, right? When he was, when he later on he was working with students at Oxford. He was teaching them how to do well, use that logic he received from his mother, and use his father's argumentation style, and be a very effective apologist. So, 1894. he had his eye on this lady, Florence, right, for a while at church. And as I mentioned in my previous video, Flora had already dated one of the Lewis boys, had dated for like 5 years, and she was not interested in signing up back for that rodeo. So she very gently declined on multiple occasions Albert's invitation to date. But Albert didn't give up. They both loved literature. They called themselves disciples of Ruskin, John Ruskin, the art critic, and by the time they began exchanging letters and talking about Ruskin, and eventually a relationship blossomed pretty naturally. So they actually were married in 29 August of 1894, and the very next year, Warren is born. Warren, we've got several pictures of Warren as a child. There were lots of family photos sort of taken around that time when the children were young. And then, of course, 3 years later, 1898, C.S. Lewis arrives. It's a great family dynamic. Although Flora felt it was very unconventional and felt she would not make a good wife, she made an excellent wife. And letters between them throughout their relationship illustrate how much she loved him and how great their relationship was. And she knew Albert very well. She was a wonderful wife and mother, But let's talk for just a minute. Here's this man with a very successful career, a great marriage, 2 kids. His wife passes away in 1908 of cancer. He sends the children off to school, assuming wrongly that work will kind of bury all the grief when it really just prolongs it. As C.S. Lewis becomes an adolescent, right? He goes, he gets in Oxford. Albert is incredibly proud of all the work and academics that C.S. Lewis was able to do as a young boy. Even Kirkpatrick said, this kid is brilliant. He's brilliant. And Albert was incredibly proud of his kid. And like I said, the apple doesn't fall far. So what happened here? What happened, and why did Albert have such a strained relationship with C.S. Lewis? Like, why did that occur? Well, there were a couple of different things. First of all, Surprised by Joy talks about how Albert was incredibly busy with his job. Warren actually talks about this as well and says, he never wanted to go on the holidays. He was very busy. But as I just mentioned, he had multiple clients on top of an already sort of burgeoning list of people that he wanted to help because he wanted to give them aid because he knew they couldn't really afford great representation. And so he sort of felt it was his Christian duty to do this work. Now, what happens when you feel very passionate and very good about your job is that you get overloaded, right? And that can happen quite naturally if you're not watching yourself and not sort of setting boundaries. So what happened was Albert became very involved with his job. He did love his job. He enjoyed his job. But when people were needing him, he didn't want to turn away. He wanted to help them and do what he felt was his Christian duty to help folks. So he was very adamant that he do what he can to help the people around him. And like, again, it wasn't just about civic duty or work duties. It was about a Christian duty he felt like he had to other people. He also had the Victorian tendencies. I put those in air quotes because mid-Victorians are sort of looked at with a sneer by their modern counterparts. Victorians were very straight-laced, very businesslike, very workaholic, and so Albert was very typically a Victorian. He very much worked his way up right out of being working class and to much better circumstances for himself and his family. So he verified that this is a way to succeed. But he never knew how to really slow down once he succeeded. And he very much, even though he was excellent at rhetoric, he struggled to communicate with his sons. There was just a wall there that he really struggled to jump over. And every time that he tried to pull them closer, his boys felt like they were being suffocated by him, right? So we have all that. And then on top of that, we have to also understand that C.S. Lewis was at the time hiding his relationship with Mrs. Moore from his father, but his father was still basically financing his lifestyle with these two other people in tow, with Mrs. Moore and Maureen in tow. And he did know about it. There is a letter between he and Warren. But that private, sort of secret relationship did put a strain on the family. And although Albert knew what he was doing, and Albert knew how Lewis was constantly struggling for money, and he did know that he was supporting 3 people and not just one, Lewis felt that he could not talk about that. He didn't want to talk about that. He knew his dad was very strict with money, and that's because he grew up, being from a poorer family. So even when he came into money later after working so hard, he really struggled with money. And, he did his whole life. So here we are. Where he's at the end of his life. In 1929, C.S. Lewis writes the letters to Owen Barfield, where he basically says, I have no love for my father. I wish I did, but I don't. There's just too many walls erected. Although Albert was consistently loving and accepting and continued to reach out, continued to pursue a deeper relationship. And the very last time that all 3 of them were together, they actually did have a very good time. I think the letter said something about no clouds, all sun. So in other words, it was very good. No, nothing, rough or difficult. All 3 men seemed very relaxed and happy to be with each other. And that was, and thankfully that was the last time all 3 of them were together before Albert's death. Now, Warren actually writes a little bit in the Lewis papers about Albert and characterizing him, so I wanted to read that for you. It says, he preserved throughout his life a high and scrupulous standard of honor. I have heard his managing clerk relate that not once, but many times, he has seen Albert throw open the door of the inner office and hustle out a would-be client with the words, in fact, you want to make use of my legal knowledge to help you commit a swindle? Get out of this. And I speak from personal knowledge of the man when I say that the latter sentence, delivered with all the force of his formidable personality, had the effect of a kick with a heavy boot. In appearance, he was of middle height, well built, and of a commanding presence. His hair, which was black, was naturally lustrous. He wore parted at the side. A fine forehead and heavy brows covered a pair of penetrating dark brown eyes. The mouth was concealed by a strong mustache. The chin was firm. In his whole bearing there was an airy authority heightened by the timbre of his voice, which was strong and resonant. Both women and men considered him good-looking. As the years mellowed him, his appearance was improved by the elimination of a sullen, almost sulky air, which he had in middle life. He was proud of his appearance, and as sensitive on the score of his age, which he would never disclose, as any fading spinster. Amongst his idiosyncrasies was an almost childish resentment of bodily pain. A corn loomed larger in his horizon than bankruptcy, and a headache was a family disaster. But when the end came, he died bravely and without murmuring. So even in the last days, Albert was still trying to keep up good spirits. He had some issues. He was diagnosed with colon cancer, so that he basically worked almost up until his death. He worked as long as he could because he felt that need to continue to help people. He was incredibly generous with many folks throughout his years, not just his sons, but very generous with his money. And he basically went into cardiac arrest and passed away on September 25th of 1929. Now, we hear a lot about what Albert wasn't. Oh, he wasn't a great father, and he wasn't this, and he wasn't that. But to his city, to his clients, and to the people he helped, he was a hero. And I feel like a lot of times, a lot of biographies misconstrue who Albert really was, because we're looking at him through our lens and not sort of seeing him as a Victorian in essence, with different principles and values, and culture was way different then. It was actually pretty common for the head of the household to take off and be gone for weeks or months with work, and the woman sort of just handle everything. But once Flora was gone, Albert tried so hard to fill her spot, and he just couldn't do it. But he still tried up until his last breath to maintain a friendship with his sons. So the Belfast Telegraph on his death posted this: "The death of Mr. Lewis removed from our midst a strong, upright man, a faithful friend, a keen and able advocate, a cultured and educated gentleman. And by his death, the city in which his brilliant professional career was spent is appreciably the poorer." And there you have it. A man who's caused a lot of controversy. Some call him sort of the angry Welsh father, but that definitely wasn't him either. Sure, he was passionate. Yes, he was Welsh, but Albert Lewis was a complicated man, and just like many of us, had his own foibles, his own problems, but he tried really hard to be a good Christian and a good father. And that's the Albert that I like to think about when we talk about C.S. Lewis and his family. So, a man who loved reading, passed it on to his sons, and a man who was duty-bound to do better for the world around him. So, guys, thanks for listening. I love all of you, and I will see you next time.